Please, forgive me.
You chose this.
I was wrong. I'll do anything.
It's too late.
Don't turn away, but please, I beg you. You made your choice.
The tarmac was still wet from the rain that had passed an hour before, and the sunset behind the jet was the kind of orange that made everything look like it was on fire. I stood there in a dress the color of champagne, my hand resting on the curve of my stomach, and I did not look at him. Not yet. Jinwoo Kang was on his knees. The man who controlled half the shipping routes on the East Coast. The man port bosses called before they called the police. The man 6 grown men in black suits stepped aside for without being told that man was kneeling on wet concrete in a $2,000 suit, hands pressed together like he was praying to something he didn't believe in 20 minutes ago. Simone. His voice cracked on my name. Please. I held the sonogram in one hand and a pair of baby shoes in the other. Cream-colored, barely bigger than my thumb. I hadn't planned on bringing them. I don't know why I did. Please, what? Jinwoo? Don't get on that plane. Behind him, his men stood like statues, sunglasses on, even with the sun almost gone, watching their boss beg a woman he once said he'd never want a child with. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I sat with it for 4 years. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Drop unwanted if you already know how this ends. 2 years earlier, I was Mrs. Kang on paper and nothing else in his house. I am a black woman from a family that came from nothing, married into a Korean crime dynasty that had everything. And I promised myself I would not shrink myself down to fit into whatever box that house wanted to put me in. I kept my hair big. I kept my laugh loud. I kept my opinions exactly as sharp as they were before I put on that ring. If they wanted a quiet trophy wife, they married the wrong woman. The first time I met his mother, she looked me over the way you'd look over a used car somebody was trying to convince you was worth the price. She's very expressive, she said to Jinwoo in Korean, thinking I couldn't understand a word of it. I'd spent 4 months studying the language before that dinner specifically, so I wouldn't walk into that house deaf and blind to what was being said about me at my own table. Thank you, I said back, in Korean, smiling the whole time. I try to be. Jinwoo almost choked on his wine. That was the first time I saw something close to respect cross his face, and for one foolish, hopeful year, I let myself believe that respect might grow into something warmer. It didn't. Jinwoo wasn't cruel to me. That's the part people don't expect. He wasn't cold in the dramatic way you see in movies, slamming doors and raising his voice. He was worse than that. He was polite, distant in a way that felt like living next to a man instead of with one. We shared a bed some nights and a silence every single morning. He'd leave for the office before I woke and come home after I'd already eaten dinner alone at a table built for 12 people, set for one. There was a night, maybe 8 months into the marriage, when I got sick a stomach virus that had me on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, and I heard him come home, heard his footsteps stop outside our bedroom door, heard him stand there for almost a full minute before he kept walking to the guest room instead of checking on me. I never told him I heard that. I just filed it away, quietly. The way I filed away every other small proof that I was a fixture in that house and not a person in it. Then I got pregnant. I found out on a Tuesday. I remember because I sat in the bathroom of that enormous house, staring at 2 pink lines, and for exactly 4 minutes I let myself imagine that this could change something between us. That maybe a man who kept every door in his life locked might open one for his own child. I sat there and pictured him coming home to find out, pictured his face, softening the way I'd only ever seen it soften around Eugene's kids at holidays, pictured a version of our marriage that finally had a reason to exist. I didn't tell anyone right away. I wanted one more day of just knowing it myself, holding a secret that was entirely mine before it became something that had to be managed, discussed, arranged the way everything else in that house got arranged. I bought a little onesie online that afternoon, cream-colored, and hid it at the bottom of a drawer full of scarves I never wore. I went looking for him that same night to tell him. I found him in his father's study instead, and the door was open just enough for me to hear everything before I said a single word. "Yongchul, you've been married to Simone long enough now," his father was saying. "What are your plans for children?" "There is no emotional bond between Simone and me," Jinwoo said, and his voice did not even shake. If she ever got pregnant, that child would not be mine in any way that mattered. I would never want a child with her. I married her because the family needed the alliance. That is all this ever was. I stood in that hallway with my hand over my mouth and a positive pregnancy test in my pocket, and something in me went very, very quiet. I didn't cry that night. I want you to understand that. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't wait around for an explanation I already knew I wasn't going to get. I went back to our room. I packed one bag, and I sat on the edge of the bed until morning, holding my stomach and talking to a baby that didn't exist to anyone else yet, but already meant more to me than every year I'd spent in that house. The next morning, I handed him divorce papers over breakfast. "What is this?" He looked at the folder like it might bite him. Divorce agreement. "Are you serious? Do I look like I'm joking?" "There has to be a reason." "There's no reason. The contract's term is up. Are you renewing it or not?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched him decide, right there at that table, that pushing for an answer wasn't worth whatever it might cost him to hear it. That's the thing about a man who's spent his whole life avoiding vulnerability. Even when the truth is standing right in front of him, holding a pen, he'll choose not to ask the question that might actually get him an answer. "Fine," he said. "Sign it and it's done. Is there anything else you want to say to me?" I asked him. One last door, cracked open, just in case. He looked at me. Really looked, for maybe the first time in 2 years. No. Then I have nothing else to say either. I signed my name under his. I left my ring on the nightstand. And the next morning, before the house woke up, I got on a plane by myself. 4 weeks pregnant, with one suitcase and a savings account I'd been quietly building since the day I understood exactly what kind of marriage I was in. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a number. I left because staying meant raising a child in a house where the father had already decided, out loud, to someone else, that the child would never be wanted. I wasn't going to let my baby grow up feeling that. Not for one single day. By noon, before I even reached the airport, 3 black cars rolled past the departure lane slow enough for me to feel the warning in it. Kang men did not chase loudly. They closed exits. They made phone calls. They convinced airline clerks to look twice at passports. One of Jinwoo's father's assistants called me 6 times from a blocked number, then left one message. "Mrs. Kang, mistakes made in emotion become family problems. Come back before this becomes difficult." I deleted it in the bathroom stall with my suitcase pressed against my knees. That was the first time my hand shook. Not because I wanted to go back, but because I finally understood the difference between leaving a husband and leaving a dynasty. A husband misses you. A dynasty hunts its missing property. So I did the only smart thing left. I took off my ring, dropped it into a trash can beside the sinks, bought a cash ticket under my middle name for the second leg of the trip, and walked through security with my coat loose around a secret nobody in that family was ever going to own. I didn't sleep on that flight. I ran numbers in my head instead, how many months my savings would stretch, what neighborhoods in Atlanta I could actually afford, whether the aunt who'd offered me a couch to sleep on for a few weeks still meant it. I was 28 years old, pregnant, divorced from a man worth more than some small countries, and I had exactly $11,000 to build an entire life from scratch. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because that's not a fairy tale amount. That's a figure it out or don't eat amount. I landed and went straight to my aunt's apartment, a 1-bedroom in East Point that already had her and her 2 kids crammed into it, and I slept on an air mattress that lost air every single night for 3 weeks before I could afford a real bed. I didn't tell her everything at first, not the marriage, not the money I'd walked away from, none of it. I just told her I needed a place to land while I figured things out, and she never once asked me to explain myself further than that. Some family understands that a woman showing up quiet and pregnant doesn't need an interrogation. She just needs a door that opens. Somewhere over the Pacific that night, a woman decided she was done being an afterthought in her own life. That decision is the whole story. I landed in Atlanta with nothing but a suitcase, a bank account that would cover about 8 months if I was careful, and a stomach that was just barely starting to show. I want to tell you the next part wasn't hard, but that would be a lie, and I promised you honesty. It was hard. It was terrifying some nights. I sat in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a space heater that only worked if you hit it just right. And I designed jewelry by lamplight because that's the one thing that had always been fully mine, untouched by his family, untouched by that house. I started small. I sold custom pieces out of my apartment, one client at a time, word of mouth from women who wanted jewelry that actually looked like it was made for them instead of designed around them. I named the line after my grandmother, Odessa. I poured every ounce of the woman I'd been hiding in that marriage into every single piece, bold, unapologetic, dripping in gold the way I'd always wanted to be seen and never was. There were nights during that first pregnancy when I sat at my kitchen table with a bag of gold wire and a single lamp, 7 months pregnant and swollen-ankled, hand-forming pieces I couldn't afford to have manufactured yet, because the alternative was letting the fear win. I remember calling my mother crying once, not because I regretted leaving, but because building something from absolutely nothing is a particular kind of exhausting nobody warns you about. She told me the same thing her mother told her. Ain't nobody coming to save you, baby, so you might as well build something worth saving yourself. My son was born on a Thursday in March, in a hospital 40 minutes from that bridal shop, with my mother holding one hand and a nurse I'd never met before holding the other, because there was no one else in that delivery room, and I refused to let that fact make me feel small. I named him Elias, after no one, because I wanted him to be the first of something instead of a continuation of anything Kang. I raised him in that first apartment for the first year, the paint peeling, the space heater that only worked if you hit it just right. Then, in a slightly better one, where the heat actually worked and Elias had his own room instead of a crib in the corner of mine. Then, 18 months after I landed in Atlanta with one suitcase, a boutique in Buckhead picked up my line on consignment 6 pieces, displayed in the back corner near the register, and I sat in my car in that parking lot afterward and cried for 10 straight minutes because it was the first time since I'd left that anyone outside my own apartment had looked at something I made and said it was worth paying for. 3 months after that, a stylist for someone genuinely famous wore one of my pieces on a red carpet, a gold cuff I'd designed at 2 a.m, while Elias cut his first teeth, and my phone did not stop ringing for 6 weeks straight. Orders came in faster than I could fill them. I hired my first employee, then my third, then my 10th. 2 years after I landed with one suitcase, Odessa Gold had a studio with my name on the lease and 11 women on payroll, every single one of them building something alongside me, instead of for me. There were women in Jinwoo's world, the kind who'd sat across from me at family dinners, with the same look his mother gave me the first night we met, who heard about my line before he ever did. One of them, a woman I'll call Hana, who used to make quiet little comments at those dinners about how some people just aren't built for this life, ended up commissioning a piece from Odessa Gold without realizing whose name was on the studio door until she walked in for her fitting. I watched her face change in real time. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. I just measured her wrist and told her the piece would be ready in 3 weeks. The Kang family found the edges of my life twice before Jinwoo did. Once, a man with no appointment walked into the studio and asked too many questions about shipping addresses, supplier names, and whether the owner ever traveled with security. Renee clocked him before I did. She smiled, offered him water, and wrote down the license plate of the black sedan idling outside. That night, Eugene called me from Korea and said, very quietly, "My father knows there is a jewelry designer in Atlanta using your grandmother's name. Be careful." Careful meant changing suppliers. Careful meant a second lock on the studio door. Careful meant teaching Elias that if a stranger ever said his mother's old last name, he was to find me immediately. I hated that part. I hated that a 4-year-old had to know even one rule born from another man's empire. But fear did not send me back. Fear made me precise. Building something on your own doesn't just cost you money and sleep. It costs you the illusion that hard work alone guarantees a straight line to success. There was a stretch, right around year 3, when a bigger jewelry house, one quietly financed by a rival family that hated the Kangs, tried to muscle into the same niche I'd spent years building. They copied a signature clasp almost line for line, launched it at a fraction of my price, then sent whispers through the boutiques that Odessa Gold was only a runaway Mafia wife's hobby. For 6 weeks, I watched wholesale orders dry up. I remember sitting in my studio after closing, staring at a spreadsheet that suddenly looked a lot more fragile than it had a month before, and feeling the old fear creep back in the fear that had nothing to do with Jinwoo at all. The fear that says a black woman building something of her own is always one bad quarter away from someone bigger deciding to take it. I didn't have a legal team the size of theirs. I didn't have the kind of money that buys silence or slows down a competitor with paperwork. What I had was the same thing I'd always had. My name, my story, my hands. So I told my story, publicly, for the first time. Not the marriage, not Jinwoo. None of that. I wasn't ready for that part yet, but the part about starting with one suitcase and a sketchbook, about hand-forming pieces at 2 a.m, 7 months pregnant, about naming the whole company after a grandmother who never got to see a fraction of what her stubbornness made possible. I posted it myself. No publicist, no polish, just the truth in my own words. It didn't go viral in some fairy tale way overnight, but it moved something. Women started buying from me specifically because the story was real, because there was nothing manufactured about a woman who built something with her hands instead of inheriting it with her name. The Bigger House's copycat piece got quietly discontinued 8 months later. Mine is still in the collection today, and it still outsells everything else I've ever designed. I want every single woman watching this to understand something plainly. You do not need a powerful man's name, his money, or his forgiveness to build something that outlasts whatever tried to break you first. You need your own hands and the refusal to disappear quietly. That's the whole formula. That's always been the whole formula. I didn't need his money. I didn't need his name. I built something with my own 2 hands that didn't ask permission from a single Kang to exist, and every single person who watched me walk into that house 4 years ago as somebody's quiet, overlooked wife got to watch me become somebody entirely on my own terms. That's the part nobody expects from a woman who leaves. They expect her to disappear. They don't expect her to come back bigger than the thing that tried to shrink her. I found out much later through his sister, who never stopped reaching out, even after everything that Jinwoo looked for me for almost the entire 4 years I was gone. He hired people. He called in favors with men who owed him things they were terrified to be reminded of. He flew to 3 different countries chasing rumors that turned out to be nothing. His father cut him out of 2 council meetings for wasting manpower on a woman who left properly and should stay gone. One rival captain even tried to use the rumor of my pregnancy as leverage, and Jinwoo shut down an entire port for 12 hours until the man apologized on his knees. I learned that part from Eugene, and I hated how complicated it made my chest feel. His sister told me he stopped going to family dinners because he couldn't sit at a table and pretend he wasn't calculating every single time whether this was the week someone finally found me. I don't tell you this because I needed him to suffer to feel like I'd won something. I tell you this because it matters that a man who once said, out loud, to his own father, that he'd never want a child with me, spent 4 years unable to let go of the woman he said that about. People don't chase what they don't want. They chase what they were too much of a coward to claim when they had it standing right in front of them. His sister was the one who told him I was back in the country. Not because I asked her to keep it secret, but because I genuinely didn't think about him enough anymore to plan around the possibility of him finding out. That's what healing actually looks like, by the way. Not thinking about someone every day anymore. Not because you forced yourself to stop, but because your life got full enough of other things that there simply wasn't room for him in it. Eugene told me later there was a near miss about 1.5 years into my time away. Jinwoo's men had traced a wire transfer from an Atlanta boutique to a supplier account and gotten as far as the shopping center parking lot before the trail went cold, because I'd paid that particular invoice in cash out of habit, not caution. He sat in his car outside that same boutique for 2 hours that day, according to her, not going in, just watching people come and go, wondering if one of the pieces in the window had my hands on it. He never found out it did. He talks about you like you're a ghost he's not allowed to grieve. Eugene told me once, on one of the rare calls we still had. Like grieving you would mean admitting you're really gone. He showed up at one of my trunk shows 3 weeks ago, but he was not the first man from his world to arrive that night. That honor belonged to Chairman Bake, a rival elder with silver hair, polite hands, and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He came to buy a necklace for his daughter, or so he said. What he really came to do was see whether the rumors were true, whether Jinwoo Kang's vanished wife had rebuilt herself into a woman with clients powerful enough to make old men nervous. It was a good night, the kind I'd worked years for. The studio was full, string lights strung across the exposed brick, 30 women in various stages of trying on pieces from the new collection, a jazz trio in the corner. Champagne I could actually afford now instead of the kind I used to be served at his family's table without ever being asked if I even liked it. I didn't see him at first. I was mid-sentence with a client, laughing about a custom piece she wanted, redesigned a ring she wanted, reworked after a breakup, turning something that used to mean one thing into something that meant something entirely hers now. And when I turned around to grab a tray of samples, there he was, standing near the entrance in a black coat, looking at me the way you look at something you were told didn't matter and have spent years discovering you were wrong about. He'd aged in the way men age when they've spent years carrying something they refuse to name. There was grey at his temples that hadn't been there before. His hands, when I let myself notice them for half a second, were clasped in front of him, the exact same way they used to clasp when his father was disappointed in something he'd done. I didn't stop the evening for him. I finished my sentence with my client. I let the jazz trio finish their set. I let 30 women continue trying on things I built with my own 2 hands in a studio with my name on the lease, and I let Jinwoo Kang stand at the back of that room and understand, without me saying a single word, exactly how much life had continued in his absence. Chairman Baek approached first. He lifted one of my cuffs from the velvet tray and said, in Korean, "Kang should have kept better inventory." I took the cuff from his hand and set it back in its place. I am not inventory. And this is not a room where men buy access to me through jokes. The studio went quiet enough to hear ice settle in champagne glasses. That was when Jinwoo stepped forward from the entrance, not to rescue me, not to speak over me. Just far enough for Baek and every old world man in that room to understand that if they touched the life I built, they were not dealing with a runaway wife. They were dealing with a woman Jinwoo Kang had learned too late not to underestimate. Then he stopped. He let my words stand. That mattered more than the protection. He didn't approach me after that. He just watched. My assistant, Renee, told me later he stood there for almost 40 minutes, declined a glass of champagne from a server twice, and left without saying a word to anyone, including me. She said he looked, in her words, like a man watching a door he used to have a key to. I went home that night and sat on Elias's floor while he built something enormous and impractical out of blocks. And I didn't cry, and I didn't shake, and I didn't feel the ground move under me the way I used to feel it move whenever Jinwoo walked into a room. I felt something quieter than that, something closer to certainty. I had already survived the worst thing losing him could do to me. Whatever came next, I was going to meet it as the woman I'd built, not the woman he left behind. Comment if you've ever watched someone realize, too late, exactly what they gave up. The second time, he wasn't so patient. He found out where I was flying out for a show in the city, and he was waiting at the airport when my car pulled up. That's the scene I opened this story with. The rain, the jet, the 6 men in black suits who used to be his shadow, and were now just witnesses to him falling apart in public. "Please," he said again, still on his knees. And I want you to understand the old me, the woman who married him at 26 because her family needed the alliance. That woman might have felt something crack watching a man like that break in front of her. But I wasn't her anymore. I built a whole different woman in that apartment with the space heater and the sketchbook, and that woman had questions before she had feelings. "Get up, Jinwoo!" He did. Slowly, like his knees genuinely hurt from how long he'd been down there, though I suspected the real ache had nothing to do with the concrete. His men didn't move. Behind them, the jet's engine had powered down to a low hum, waiting on me and me alone. "How long have you been standing here?" I asked. "An hour. Maybe more. You could have called. You changed your number 4 years ago and never gave it to anyone who'd give it to me." That was the point. I know. He said it simply, no defensiveness in it at all, and that surprised me more than the kneeling had. The Jinwoo I married would have found a way to make even this about how hard the last 4 years had been for him. This one just stood there and let the fact sit between us, unpolished. "Say what you came to say," I told him. "You've got exactly as long as it takes me to walk to that plane." "I heard what you overheard that night," he said. "You never told me you heard it, but I know you did. I've known for almost a year, Cheng Yu told me. My assistant. She'd seen your face when you came out of that hallway. and she finally told me what she suspected. I spent so long wondering why you left without a word, and the answer was standing right there the whole time. You didn't need me to explain anything. You already knew exactly who I was. Yes, I said. I did. I was 29 years old and terrified of wanting something my father hadn't approved of first. You were never supposed to matter to me, that's what I told myself the entire first year. And by the time I realized I was lying, I didn't know how to walk it back without admitting I'd been a coward the whole time. So I said nothing. I let you believe the worst thing you ever heard about yourself, because correcting it meant admitting how wrong I'd been. That's not an apology, I said. That's an explanation for why you broke something. I didn't ask you why. I asked what you're doing here, tonight, at this airport, with an audience. I'm asking you to let me know, my son. I was wrong. His voice was rough, stripped down to something I'd never heard from him in 2 years of marriage. What I said that night was not fear dressed as honesty. It was cowardice. I used my father's approval as an excuse to reject what I was too weak to claim. I said I would never want a child with you because admitting I wanted a future with you would have made me responsible for protecting it. Now you have the sentence you should have said 4 years ago, I told him. But an apology does not erase what your words built around me. I know. Then ask for the only thing you came here for without hiding it behind me. He swallowed. I am asking you to let me earn the chance to know my son. I felt my whole chest go tight, because that was the first thing he'd said that had nothing to do with me at all. His name is Elias, I said, and he has never once, in 4 years, asked me where his father is. Do you know why? Because I never gave him a reason to feel like he was missing something. I built him a whole life that was already complete before you showed up wanting a piece of it. I know I don't deserve, you don't, I said, and I meant it plainly, without cruelty, the way you'd correct someone who got a fact wrong. You don't deserve a single thing from me. Not my time, not my forgiveness, not access to my son, just because your guilt finally caught up to you at an airport with an audience. He was quiet. His men were quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold still. So why are you still standing here? He asked, and it wasn't smug. It was the most honest question he'd ever asked me. Because I decide what happens next. Not you. Not your name. Not the men behind you. Me. Here's what I decided, and I want to walk you through it, because I think it matters more than the reunion everybody's expecting. I didn't get back together with Jinwoo Kang because he begged prettily enough at an airport. I didn't take him back because 4 years of searching proved something to me. I made him wait 6 more months. 6 months of supervised visits with Elias, on my schedule, in my city, where he had to learn how to be a father before he ever got to audition for the role of my partner again. The first visit, he showed up 45 minutes early and waited in his car rather than ring the bell before the agreed time, because I'd told him punctuality mattered to me, and he apparently decided that meant erring on the side of not being late even by a minute. He brought no gift that first day. I'd made it clear gifts weren't going to buy anything, and to his credit, he listened. He showed up every single time after that. He learned Elias hated peas before he learned anything else about being a Kang. He sat through story time on a rug in my living room in a hand-tailored suit and didn't complain once, even the time Elias spilled an entire cup of grape juice directly onto his lap and looked more terrified of my reaction than his father's. Jinwoo just laughed, genuinely laughed. A sound I realized I'd maybe heard 3 times total in the 2 years we were married, and said, "Good thing purple's my color." He asked me questions about myself during those visits, actual questions, the kind he never bothered with in 2 years of marriage. What was Elias's first word? What scared me the most those first months alone? Whether I still sketched by lamplight, or whether success had let me finally buy a better one. He listened to the answers like they mattered, taking mental notes I could watch him filing away behind his eyes. Somewhere around month 3, he asked if he could come to Elias's daycare graduation, a small, silly ceremony with paper hats and a certificate that meant nothing to anyone but the parents in that room, crying over 4-year-olds mispronouncing the word diploma. I almost said no. It felt like too much, too soon. Letting him into a room full of people who knew me now, who knew Renee and my mother and the life I'd built without a single Kang in it. But I thought about what it would cost Elias later, in some vague future conversation, to learn his father had asked and been refused over something this small. So I said yes. Jinwoo showed up in a suit that was, for once, slightly too formal for the room, and I watched him sit in a plastic chair sized for a kindergarten classroom, knees nearly at his chest, clapping louder than anyone else when Elias's name got called. He didn't try to sit near me. He didn't try to make it about anything other than our son. Afterward, in the parking lot, he thanked me not for letting him in, but for raising a child who ran up to hug complete strangers' grandparents in the hallway because that's just what Elias does, he said. You built something in him that I don't think I would have known how to build. A kind of openness. I used to think that came from money and access. It doesn't. It comes from a home where nobody has to guess what's true. I said yes, not because the 6 months were up like a sentence being served, but because somewhere in those visits, watching him kneel on my living room floor to help Elias build a block tower instead of kneeling on wet concrete to beg for something he hadn't earned yet, I started to believe he'd actually changed. Not performed change. Changed. I didn't let him back into my life because I needed him. I let him back in because he finally showed me, action by action, patient month by patient month, that he understood the difference between wanting me and deserving to be let back in. There's a difference between a man who chases you because he's afraid of losing something and a man who's actually done the work to become someone worth keeping. I made Jinwoo Kang prove which one he was, and it took him exactly as long as it took, and not one day less. Type UN Shakabla if you believe a woman should never rush her own healing just to make someone else's redemption arc feel complete. We got married again 8 months after that night at the airport. Not because tradition demanded it. Not because his family needed an alliance this time. There was no alliance left to protect. He'd already lost the only thing that ever mattered to him once and rebuilt his entire understanding of what he wanted around not losing it twice. I planned this wedding myself, on my own terms, the way I'd built everything else in the 4 years since I'd left that first ceremony behind. There was no compound this time. No father-in-law overseeing the guest list, no room full of people deciding among themselves whether I was expressive in a way that needed correcting. I chose a rooftop in Atlanta with a view of the skyline I'd built my second life against, and I invited exactly the people who'd earned a seat: my mother, Renee, the 11 women who worked at Odessa Gold and had built the studio alongside me, Jin, who cried before the ceremony even started, and a small handful of Jinwoo's men who'd apparently requested, quietly and repeatedly, to be there. I wore gold. Not champagne, not cream. Gold, the same color as the jewelry line that carried my grandmother's name across a country I built a whole life in without him. I designed my own dress details, myself hand-beaded along the neckline, heavier at the wrists where I wanted people's eyes drawn to the bracelets I'd made, because even at my own wedding I wanted to be standing in something that was unmistakably mine. Elias walked down the aisle first, 4 years old, carrying a small pillow with 2 rings on it, completely unbothered by the 6 men in black suits standing at the edges of the room like they'd finally found something worth actually protecting. Halfway down the aisle, he stopped, turned around, and yelled, "Mommy, I did it!" loud enough that half the rooftop laughed, and I laughed too, because that's the kind of wedding I wanted, one where a 4-year-old's pride could interrupt the solemn parts and nobody flinched. Jinwoo cried during the vows. Not a single controlled tear, the way I imagine he'd been trained his whole life to cry, if he had to cry at all, actual tears, unguarded, running down a face that had spent 30-some years being taught that showing this much was a weakness. The man who once told his own father he'd never want a child with me stood in front of everyone he'd ever answered to and told me that the 4 years I spent building an empire without him were the 4 years that taught him exactly what he'd been too afraid to deserve the first time around. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone, he said, his voice rough. You taught me strength means being brave enough to need someone and tell them the truth about it before you lose the chance. He looked past me, briefly, at his own men standing at the edges of that rooftop, the same men who'd watched him kneel on wet concrete months before, and something in his face settled, like he'd finally made peace with being seen exactly as he was in front of them. I didn't say anything as polished back. I told him the truth instead, because that's the only vow I know how to make. I didn't build Odessa Gold to prove anything to you, I said. I built it because I refused to let one man's cowardice decide what the rest of my life was going to look like. You get to be part of this life now, not because you begged well enough, but because you finally became someone I trust to stand beside something I built instead of trying to own it. I didn't marry him because I needed saving. I never needed saving. I built my own way out of that house, my own name, my own table with my own seat at the head of it. I married him because he finally became a man capable of sitting at that table without expecting me to shrink to fit beside him. Then came the part nobody expected. Halfway through the reception, Chairman Kang stood. The music softened by instinct because old power still knows how to make a room listen. 4 years earlier, he had stood in a study and asked his son about children like he was negotiating inventory. Now he stood on my rooftop, in my city, beneath lights my team paid for, in front of my employees, my mother, my son, and every man who had ever assumed a Kang woman existed only inside a Kang house. He raised his glass, but I did not raise mine. Not yet. Simone Odessa Carter, he said, using the name I had rebuilt before the one his family gave me, left our house with nothing we recognized as power. She returned with a name stronger than any room we tried to keep her out of. From this day, no man in our family, our council, or our business will speak of her as a woman Jinwoo reclaimed. She is not reclaimed. She stands beside him because she chose to. The room went still. His men lowered their heads first. Then Jinwoo's men. Then the old family lawyers at the back, men who had once slid contracts toward me without meeting my eyes. One by one, the people who had watched me be treated like an alliance finally acknowledged me as a force. Only then did I lift my glass. His mother was there too, in the back, and I watched her watch me the entire ceremony with an expression I couldn't quite read until the reception, when she found me near the dessert table and said, in Korean, quiet enough that only I could hear it, "I was wrong about you." I didn't need that apology. I'd stopped needing anything from that family the day I got on a plane 4 years earlier. But I let her have the moment anyway, because grace costs me nothing and I had plenty of it to spare. That's the whole story, and I want to leave you with the part that matters most, because I know exactly what kind of comment section this is going to bring, and I want to get ahead of it. This isn't a story about a man finally seeing a woman's worth. Jinwoo's redemption is his own, and he earned it the slow, unglamorous way through 6 months of supervised block towers and grape juice on his suit and questions he should have asked 4 years earlier. But that was never the engine of this story. I was never sitting in Atlanta, waiting for him to earn his way back into a life that was already whole without him. The engine of this story is a woman who was told, to her face without even being in the room, that she wasn't wanted, and instead of shrinking into that verdict, built an entire empire loud enough to make the verdict irrelevant. A black woman who left a compound full of men who thought their name was the only currency that mattered, and proved, one hand-forged piece of gold at a time, that her own name was worth more than all of it combined. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: you do not need anyone's permission to become undeniable. Not a husband's, not a mafia family's, not anyone who ever looked at you and decided, quietly, that you weren't the kind of woman worth wanting. Build the thing that makes that verdict obsolete. Everything else, the begging, the redemption arcs, the men finally showing up on their knees, that's just what happens after, if it happens at all. It was never the point. You were always the point.